Before we get started with Diane, who will introduce our stellar panel, I'd like to take a moment and introduce to you the acting president of Stockton University, Dr. Harvey Kesselman.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, what a great crowd. Let's. For Stockton students, I am really excited that you're here tonight. It's important that you, get to see the work of these wonderful artists that we have, that you also are able to listen to this robust and extraordinarily competent and well-known, quite frankly, panel on an extremely important topic that you are going to be primarily responsible for helping our world fix. And so do pay a lot of attention to what's going on tonight and to this panel discussion. And for all the rest of you who are here tonight, thank you. Thank you for supporting the Noyes Museum, of course, and also, and thank you for supporting Stockton University. We genuinely appreciate it. We have a number of faculty here and a number of staff. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not shout out the Noyes Museum staff. So thank all of you for being here tonight and enjoy this evening's presentation.
Thank you, sir. All right, so I'd like to start with introducing you to one of the artists in the show from Philadelphia who will introduce our panel. Diane.
Hi, thank you. Can you all hear me? Of course you can with this. Okay, we are under a time constraint, so I'm very happy that Saskia has provided, and Dory, a wonderful brochure on everyone who's on the panel. So all I have to do is mention their names, and you're going to figure out who they are. To the left of me is Jeff Nimitz, professor of earth science at Dickinson College. And after him, we have Michael Lemonick, writer-at-large for Climate Central. And then we have Amy Lipton, gallerist and also curator of Echo Art. And after that, Aaron O'Connor, the originator of the Arctic Residency Program, where this show originates from. And last but not least, we have the great Andrew Refkin, New York Times writer, journalist, etc. And I'm really going to leave it at that so that we have more time for everyone to talk. And please check your brochure to see really how important these people are. I was asked to begin with a very brief introduction. Let's see if this works. I just clicked it on. There we go. Okay. I'm supposed to talk about why I became an activist artist from just being an ordinary, regular landscape artist, but I felt it was more important to talk about the Arctic Residency show people first, and again to acknowledge Laura Cheney, who was my first friend in the Arctic Circle, but also Aaron O'Connor. Without him, we would not be here. So we have two images of Aaron, one inside, but the other one was outside. And then we have Jane Isaacson, who's visiting with us, whose work is in the show. And there she is experiencing the moment. We saw polar bears. And then we have Deborah Hammond, the great photographer, doing what she does. So, and here we all are as a group working. This was an incredible residency that we were on. There were 26 of us. We went all around Svalbard. We looked, we trekked, we were on the boat a lot, we were taking zodiacs to the land, and we were also landing on the shore. And we were making art while we were there, and certainly when we returned. But now back to me. There I was, just being a landscape painter, but flash forward a few years, maybe 30 or 40, I became a climate activist. It didn't start that way. I started out just making paintings of the landscape, but I realized that most of the paintings that I made were about geology. So here you have about 20, 30 years worth of work in a snapshot. And moving right along to the 2000s in 2011, this is the only image, as opposed to all those other geological images, that was more man-made than the others, because it just didn't come about naturally. This is an image from Glacier National Park, Grinnell from a helicopter ride. And the problem here is that in 1850, there were 150 glaciers in Grinnell, and now, does anyone know how many are in Grinnell? Under 25. So how did I get this epiphany? It was in a show in 106 where this painting, which happened 30 years before the exhibition, made me realize, this painting here, what was it like now? 2006 was my epiphany, because that was the same year of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, right? And also Elizabeth Colbert's book. And that sort of, it was in the air, and it made me think about change. It made me think about climate. And so I began my research into the first thing I found, repeat photography. This is what geologists would do. They would go back to glaciers year after year and realize they were changing. They were changing very quickly. As I said, from 1850 to 2011, that's a big change, because glaciers take thousands upon thousands of years to grow, and there they are, moving very quickly. I also learned about recessional lines and made paintings about those. I also learned about maps from USGS and used some of those images. I also loved looking at Landsat maps. And all this was about learning about science and trying to figure out why the heck so many people don't believe in science. Check out this National Geographic. I knew that scientists were making graphs, they were showing and trying to explain things to the people, but I, as an artist, had to figure out a way to do it through my imagery. And the best way to do it, I realized, was to get there. And so I became a witness. I went to Antarctica, I went to the Arctic, and this is just a brief view of seeing both those experiences really fast, because I have less than 5 minutes, and some of the experiences that what they produced in terms of grids. This one is in the show, and it is about the Arctic, where I was with my fellow artists here. And this is a map that shows you our route, where we went with Aaron O'Connor in September, October of 2013. This is a map of where I went with some geologists, scientists at the, well, it's the oldest and the most northern research station in the world. And I went by plane, helicopter there, and there you see me very happy on top of my first glacier. And there we are in Greenland a year later, Greenland grid. Here are some examples of paintings, and this was the last expedition I went on with students on ice with my husband Richard, and there's a bunch of students that we were with going to Antarctica, and after that we went to Patagonia. Patagonia has the third largest ice field in the world, so I can now say I've been to all three: Antarctica, Greenland, Patagonia. And here we are in Patagonia looking at that. These are some recent images, and this is also Patagonia, and this is a recent studio shot and some recent work, and that's it. This is what I'm up to, but what I really want us to talk about now is, what is the world up to? What are we doing about these issues, and do we understand them? And I turn it over to a great scholar who's going to explain that to us in 10 minutes or less.
Yeah. So I have been tasked with, in 10 minutes, telling you about all there is to know about climate science, which means to me that you've asked me to do the impossible. I'm going to do very quickly. This is, again, a 10-minute kind of thing, and trying to do this fairly quickly. But I start off with this image, which I think is quite symbolic of what we're up against. The ship could hold anything. It could hold water, it could hold food, it could have oil in it, coal, you name it, and it's headed for something pretty nasty. And that's exactly where we're headed. We are this ship, and we are moving resources around on this planet and using them up at quite an astounding rate. And because of what we're doing with fossil fuels and burning CO2 in the atmosphere, we are changing the way this planet works. So what you need to know is partly that the big picture is that we have one planet. You probably already figured that out. We have one planet, we have a finite number of resources, and we are using those resources up at a pretty high rate, particularly the fossil fuels, burning coal and so forth, in order to improve the economy of the world, in order to have basically life on this planet. But we are also messing with a system that is very, very complicated, and scientists really don't have a complete handle on it, although they know a lot more than they knew 20, 25, 30 years ago about what's happening. But we're beginning to see some of the things that are happening. So just briefly, you should know that all these different parts of the world are connected to each other. The ocean is connected to the atmosphere, it's connected to the land, the biosphere, the plants and animals on the land are part of the picture, and so is the ice. And they all interact with one another, and they all feedback. I'll show you a feedback mechanism in a minute. They all feed on each other. So if one thing changes, it has consequences for everything else. So normally, the world does change. It's been changing over all of geologic time, what we call deep time. And there's been climate that's been much hotter than we have now and much colder. Obviously, the ice ages were much colder than we are now. But we've never seen quite this kind of change as rapidly. So we're getting into a situation that we have not seen. We're experimenting with the planet that we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And we have to understand all these very big systems. What's the role of the oceans? How much CO2 can the atmosphere actually hold before we start to see really ill effects? What does the biosphere have to do with this? What does a very slow process we call weathering have to do with this? The rocks are weathering very slowly, and believe it or not, they actually use up some of that CO2. So everything's connected. There's some very big issues, very big drivers that are part of this that are acting in the background on top of what we're doing to it. Long-term change, the continents moving around, mountains being built. There's inherent climate change in the system that has to do with the interaction between the sun, the moon, and the earth, and so forth. There's lots of things going on. Even the strength of the sun has changed over time. But those are such long-term processes, we would never see them in the geologic record the way we're seeing things now. So just for the sake of wondering what you do know about this, of course, the greenhouse effect is the big issue here. The greenhouse effect is actually a good thing. We think of the greenhouse effect in terms of being a bad thing because we're putting too much CO2 in the atmosphere. But if it weren't for the greenhouse effect and the small amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere, we would be a very cold planet. So the atmosphere keeps us moderate. It keeps this planet habitable. Compared to Mars, where the atmosphere is 96%, or Venus, sorry, the atmosphere is 96% CO2. They have a runaway greenhouse effect. It's 465 degrees on the surface of Venus. All right, so we keep our atmosphere and our planet at about 15 degrees centigrade, right, which is about 55 degrees, 60 degrees on average. If you start putting more of that gas into the atmosphere, and there are other greenhouse gases like methane and some of these other things, you will start exacerbating that greenhouse effect. Right? The sun coming through as ultraviolet rays change into infrared, and they begin to then bounce around, if you will, inside the atmosphere. And as they do that, they give off heat. It's not unlike in your car in the summer in a parking lot. Right? You close up your car, you go into the store, you come out. Why is your car so much hotter than outside your car? Because of the greenhouse effect. Right? So you're spending a lot of energy being put into the atmosphere. All right, change is going to happen, as I said, and this is, you may not be able to read all these things, but people don't like change. We don't like change. What we really are going to talk about here is rate of change. It's the rate of change that's really getting to us. And this little graph shows lots and lots of different things, but I hope you can see that the graph on the left-hand side at lower, in the past, 1750 and so forth, the lines are relatively flat. Things aren't going up very fast. And then all of a sudden, around 1900, 1950, the lines go exponential, right? They're going straight up. And that's where we are right now. We're beginning to see very, very high changes. So how does this compare to the past? I've said we had climate change that's been significant. Well, if you look at the last 400,000 years in ice cores, which are very good indicators of past climate, what we call proxies, you see that the CO2 levels, which suggest temperature, have gone up and down quite a bit. They fluctuated between approximately 185 parts per million up to almost 300. And that's where the dashed red line is. But look what's happened more recently. The line has gone way over the long-term maximum. So we are outside the standard deviation quite a bit. And in fact, this is not even an accurate graph. We're now up over 400. I actually looked at it this morning. We're up to 401. All right, so if we look at this last little bit, which is really where we live, 1850 to the present, what's coming to be called the Anthropocene, you can see the correlation between the red, which is temperature, the change in temperature over time, the gray, which is the amount of fossil fuels being burned, carbon emissions and carbon equivalent, if you will, and the blue line, which is the amount of CO2. Pretty good correlation. They're all doing this exponential thing. So we are sending more and more of that CO2 into the atmosphere. It is continuing to increase the temperature. So how does this happen? How does this then figure out what's going on with all this? Well, it works on what we call feedback mechanisms, and this is just one. There's lots and lots of them. And we think of a feedback mechanism, when we say that a feedback mechanism is a positive feedback, what happens is something happens, it exacerbates something, and then it makes it worse. and it gets worse and worse and worse and worse. If you have a negative feedback mechanism, something happens, the Earth responds to it, and it brings it back to equilibrium. All right, so we are seeing a lot of these positive feedbacks. So for example, in this case, we have warm temperatures. Warm temperatures melt snow and ice. Snow and ice is a reflector of the solar radiation. If you have less snow and ice, you have less reflectivity. The sea, which is dark, absorbs more heat, and it gets warmer. And it keeps on going and going and going. And that's the kind of thing we're in now, and that's what's making it a lot worse. So this is to kind of go back to see what the future holds. You can see the red line is that historic trend that's in the ice cores, and there we are at the end, close to today, and you'll see that the blue dot represents where we were in 2008. Above the line, we're even higher than that now, we're up to 400. What will happen, presumably, by 2100? Not very far off, actually. Your kids, your grandkids will be in that realm, right? If we are able to reduce emissions significantly, we may only go as high as 550, right? So 150 ppm over where we are now. If we do nothing, business as usual, we could be up at 900, right? Now that may not mean much to you, but let's put some temperatures in here. At 450, you're probably going to have at least a 2-degree increase global temperature change, global, right? You have to remember that. This is global. It's the whole world. That means it could be very hot in some places and actually chillier in other places, all right? But when you get up to 6 degrees, that's going to get pretty warm, all right? So what are the impacts of that? And this is a complicated diagram, and you probably have read about a lot of things. We're down here in the right-hand corner right now with almost a degree's worth of change, and you have heat waves, you have ocean warming, you have ice caps melting, you have sea level rising, you have droughts, you have extreme weather, and so forth, effects on biological species as well. It just gets worse from there, and you start seeing some of these things. If we go to 6 degrees or more, it's possible that the planet will be relatively uninhabitable. There won't be enough water. There won't be enough food. Whole systems will collapse. If all of Greenland melts, sea level will go up 6 meters. If Antarctica melts on top of it, sea level will go 65 meters above where it is right now. That would drown most of the east coast of the United States, right? So I think I'm going to stop there. I have some other things that I have some other things that I'd love to tell you about, but you can ask me questions.
Okay.
All right, but I'm going to beat him. I'm going to do it in 5 minutes.
I had lots more slides.
I know, but maybe later.
There we go. Okay, so I'm not a scientist. I'm a journalist. I used to write for this publication, and my job's a little bit different from what you've heard up until now. My job is to tell the public about what's going on in the world of science. I am not an activist. I am not, I don't go marching. What I try and do is explain to people what's going on with science, and I try to do it as honestly as possible. And we'll get to a point in just a little bit where you'll see why it gets a little difficult to be as honest as possible, or it's problematic. So 1987, I was working Time magazine, and one of our Washington correspondents brought a bunch of scientists in to tell the editors, the editor-in-chief and all the important editors, about this thing called the greenhouse effect and why we should care about it. And at this point, I knew what it was. I had heard of it. And I heard that vaguely that it could be a problem in some theoretical way sometime in the future. And so these scientists sat down and said, no, you guys should take this really seriously. You should do a story about it. This is really important. And they explained to us why. And when they were done, they went through all those explanations of what's going on and all those graphs and charts, but this was 1988, so things were not quite so bad. And we said to them, okay, so what are we seeing from this terrible problem that we're causing? What's the evidence that it's happening? And they said, well, there is no evidence. We have no evidence. All we have is a theoretical model that makes sense to us. Everything we think we understand about how the atmosphere works and how fossil fuels work and all that stuff makes us very convinced that this is likely to be a problem. There could be something that would happen, one of these feedback effects, that would stave it off. So maybe all this warming air will evaporate a lot of water. It'll make a lot of clouds, cover the Earth in a white cover of clouds, reflect sunlight, and it'll cool off again. That could happen. We don't know. Still, this could be really dangerous if it gets out of control. You should do a story. So we did a story, but we weren't convinced enough that the greenhouse effect alone was enough, no evidence, to do a cover story on. So if you'll look at the image there, we also talked about the ozone hole, which we did know about. It was happening. There was evidence. And so people were up in arms about that. And we put both things on the cover. It was about how we are changing our atmosphere and our climate. Problem is that we put these things on the same cover story. And even today, people confuse the ozone hole with the greenhouse effect. And I take personal credit for that. Anyway, so we took it seriously, but there was no evidence. About a year later, the year after we did this, Andy, were you going to show this?
No.
Okay, good. I stole this from him. So about a year later, a prominent climate scientist went in front of Congress and testified in front of Al Gore's committee, not coincidentally, and said, and I'm going to get the quote wrong, and Andy's here to keep me honest, because he reported on this, but he said, in essence, I think we can actually see something now. We can see the signal of the temperature going above the up and down noise. And I think we've got evidence that this thing is really happening. And it made huge headlines. It was, another thing that wasn't a coincidence was that this hearing took place during a terrible heat wave. Mm-hmm. And so, we journalists, we like to take advantage of these things. And there was a lot of news about it. And Andy Revkin, who was at Discover Magazine at the time, wrote a cover story about it. And I have it on my slideshow because I was also at Discover at the time, and I was the editor. So he gets the credit, but I now get to raise my hand and say I was involved. But it became a thing. It became such a thing, in fact, that during the 1988 presidential campaign, George H.W. Bush, do I have the letters right? Students, this is not the guy that you remember. This is his father. Said in a campaign speech, we are going to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. 1988. That's a great line. But a presidential candidate said that in 1988. So you would think we were starting to take this seriously. I'm already out of time. Okay. A couple of years later, and journalists, at least science journalists, did start to take it seriously. In 1999, 2000, Time magazine did not name a man of the year or woman of the year. We named Earth the planet of the year. People always ask me what planet came in second. I can't reveal that. But the lead story in that, which I did write, was about climate change and global warming. 2001, I wrote another story about global warming. And what I'm trying to get at is that journalists have been writing about this for a long time. Andy moved on to the New York Times, where he wrote innumerable stories about the science of climate change and the impacts, and genuinely explained to people what the science was about. One of the things that's happened since the 1980s is that our climate models have gotten much better. So this is a very familiar area of the world depicted in a climate model. You all recognize this? Okay, you don't. 1990s, 2004, getting better resolution. Now you know where you're looking at, right? So the climate models have gotten better. The science has gotten better. But interestingly enough, the projections of where the climate is going have not changed all that much. So those numbers that you heard about where we could be going with temperature rise, depending on how much emissions we have remained remarkably consistent. And the point you heard in the previous talk, which stuck with me since 1988, and which sticks with me still, is that, yes, climate has changed in the past, but it is never in human experience, and I mean in the entire experience of the human race, changed this fast. And there's another point that we need to make about that. Not only has it never changed this fast, but times when it did change in the past, when the last ice age began 100,000 years ago, we were little nomadic populations eating nuts and berries and wearing skins or whatever we did. We didn't have cities. We didn't have highways. We didn't have infrastructure. We didn't have agriculture. We didn't have a fertile farmland in the American Midwest. We didn't have a billion people living in India. 3 minutes left. I'll talk faster. We didn't have a world that depended so much on the climate staying the way it is. You know, in 100,000 years ago, okay, so you get an ice age. Here come the glaciers. You just keep walking south until, you know, and they're not going that fast. Seriously, sea level rises. Well, you move back a mile each year, and you're fine. Here we've got a world that is so dependent on the climate that we've had for the past 10,000 years or so, when agriculture began and when we started building cities, that the disruptions we're talking about are going to have a much huger impact. And even 100,000 years ago, it may be that when the glaciers came in, half the human race died. Well, we don't know. We survived, but it wasn't pretty maybe, but we don't even know that. If half the human race died now, I do not believe that the human race will go extinct or that the planet will be uninhabitable. But I believe that every indication is that things will get really, really, really unpleasant for a lot of people. And there will be a lot of casualties. All right, I'm probably at 0 minutes left.
You're at 8 minutes now.
Oh, I got 2 minutes left. All right, so what do I have next? Here's another thing about showing the better climate models. And one last thing I want to show you, if I can do it in this time left. Oh, okay, and here, more graphics. Climate Central likes to do graphics, and we make them glow, so you will pay attention. Same things you've seen, 10 hottest years since 1988. 2015 is going to be in there as well. Many indicators. I mean, when you say to people, what will it take to convince you that this is going on? We've got this, we've got that, we've got,
Right.
I keep pressing the button, and that doesn't go to the next slide because there's so many indicators, and yet people have a stake in not believing it, either a financial stake or a philosophical stake. You know, I'm a libertarian. You can't tell me what kind of car to drive. Or they have a religious stake. God wouldn't let this happen to us. And so that's, I think, why so many people are able, or it's going to cost money. And one last thing I'll leave you with, which is one thing that we've done and scientists have done to shoot ourselves in the foot. These are a whole bunch of model runs that show what the Atlantic sea surface temperature should be like over the next few years. So it's a big jumble of things. They're all going in the same direction. And if you do a trend line, you have a nice straight line. If we keep pumping CO2 into the air, things are going to go up. Except when you put it as a straight line, people think of it as a straight line. They're not scientists. They're not sophisticated enough. We journalists oversimplify to make a point. So you look at that and you say, okay, more CO2, more temperature. Very simple. Then you get something called the pause or the hiatus in global warming. Slowdown in global warming since about 2000, which is starting to pick up again. And people say, hey, you said it was going to go up, and for 20 years or 15 years, it's been flat. This disproves everything you've said, which is nonsense. Because if you look at this thing and take out just one model, take out that model, and look at it by itself, you see that you will have slowdowns and speed-ups because there are other natural cycles that are involved. And so the hiatus is right there, but we don't do that. And if you looked at that part of that one model, you say, oh, it's going down, therefore global warming is refuted. So we have a job to do to help people understand, and we have not always done the best job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Amy, why don't you go next and break up the science part, and then we'll end with science.
We're going to have a breather with all these facts, and we're going to turn to Amy Lipton, who's going to...
There were no facts in my, oh, I guess there were.
I think they were facts. I learned a lot of facts.
And there are no facts in art
No
whatsoever.
facts. Art is all la-la land, right, Amy? Okay.
Well, not the artists I work with. All right. So I am a curator, and I also work with a nonprofit organization called Eco Art Space. And Eco Art Space has been around for about 15 years, long enough to see a steady increase in the belief in things like climate change. When we first started, it was completely like, why are artists doing this at all? Like, you know, why are artists working with scientists? What's the reason? You know, Diane's probably encountered this a little bit, but that's changing, I'm very happy to say. So in my organization, I work with artists who are actually collaborating with scientists and with engineers and with architects and with designers and with various community members to try to bring about a visual way of communicating what's happening with the environment. So this artist named Aviva Mosher did a project called the High Water Line in 2007, where she spent 6 months taking one of those baseball chalk markers that you see with lines in baseball fields and football fields and marking the streets of Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan. And she took this line and was trying to show the 100-year flood line all through the water's edge. So this was you would call this a performance art piece, but of course it had a visual component of making this blue chalk line. And during the course of her project, she talked and stopped and went through a lot of neighborhoods and showed people where maybe where their house was is where this 100-year flood line was, and that if something happened, like a huge hurricane event, they might be underwater. So she did this as a sort of, project to raise awareness, and sure enough, just a few years later, after her high water line project, we saw Hurricane Sandy do almost exactly what she had been talking about. So my organization, Eco Art Space, worked with Eve Mosher, and we made something called an action guide to explain Eve's process, because after doing this in New York City and Brooklyn, she's been invited to do it in cities all around the world, including cities that are very prone to flooding, like in Miami. And she can't travel over the world. She's a young mom with 2 kids, so we did this high water action guide to give people the opportunity to do this in their own communities, and it has been happening. In fact, in Philadelphia, I think it's planned for next year. So those of you close enough to Philly will get to experience the high water line in Philly. This is another artist named Tatfu Tan. He's originally from Malaysia, but he lives in Staten Island. And so he really was more or less a victim of Hurricane Sandy, in the sense that when it happened, he was trapped on Staten Island. There was no way for him to get off the island, and the grocery stores were quickly running out of food. I mean, Manhattan is an island, and they're really subject to dependency on grocery stores, delis, and restaurants, and that is really not going to last very long, as we saw what happened with Sandy. So Tatfu came up with this idea to do something called New Earth Meals Ready to Eat, which is really something that the military has been using for a long time, dehydrated food. Not a new idea, but he decided to do his own packaging by going to grocery stores and collecting the food that they would normally be throwing away at the end of the day, or food that really isn't perfect and beautiful looking. He made this giant sculpture in the shape of a catamaran to sort of talk about the fact of being trapped on an island, and then gave out these new meals ready to eat dehydrated food. I'm going to have to go very quickly. This is a poster showing his, talking about dehydrating food and how it's a process that really keeps in the flavor of the food and the nutrition of the food. And his quote is, "Don't despair, be prepared." This was a project that happened in Crissy Field in San Francisco in conjunction with World Environment Day in 2005. This was a dance performance piece with wind socks, sort of demonstrating how wind can be used as a possibility for helping with relief from fossil fuel. This is a show that I curated in 2013 called It's the End of the World as We Know It and I Feel Fine, after the REM song. This is an artist named Aviva Romani.
That's real.
Thank you. So she took a trip from the Gulf of Maine to the Gulf of Mexico and documented these photographs of the Louisiana bayous, and made this series of photographic works called Water and Oil. And she's been working on a project since then called Gulf to Gulf, which she's based on a theory called trigger point, which has to do with looking at specific places where remediation can happen, and then as a sort of overall like acupuncture effect, that they can work in conjunction with each other to help solve climate change, and it has to do with habitat and species and all kinds of things that work together. Climate change really is a very difficult thing, I think, for artists to deal with because it's kind of an abstract concept. And so artists that I work with are focusing on numerous issues related to the environment that, all contribute in one way or another. I mean, the planet with climate change will certainly not just affect humans, it will affect all species. This is the same show, The End of the World as We Know It. This is an artist that focused on making paintings about the Three Gorges Dam in China. This is.
Speak into the microphone, please. We can't hear you back.
Sorry about that.
Thank you.
Thanks for speaking up about that. Now I'm really loud.
It's good, yeah.
So this artist, this is a show I curated, Nurturing Nature, Artists Engage the Environment at Albright College. And this is an artist who made a sculpture that was called the Handcar Project, where visitors that came in could actually push it, and you see the kids on either side pushing it up and down, which created energy, which lit up these little houses, little sculptures in the background that had images of them of corn. So her whole project, talking about all these different factors now on our resources, including, housing and fossil fuels and all these different ways that we have to survive and how there are maybe alternative ways of looking at energy use. This is an artist who actually went to the Arctic and planted a flag there, a native flag project, to try to get people to have an awareness about what's happening in the Arctic. And so he's encouraging people to each take one of these flags and put them in their own yard to kind of let everyone know that what's happening if we work together as a community and in our own neighborhoods, that we can raise awareness. Same artist, different project. This is called Endangered World, drawing of 360 endangered animals. He actually did this and made every one of these animals his Facebook profile for a day so that it was going out in social media and talking about how animals are endangered in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a project I did in Washington, D.C., a public art project with an artist named Natalie Jeremijenko, talking about pollinators in an urban setting. She created this bridge, planted bridge across this busy city street so that butterflies would have some place to pollinate and to get across the road through busy traffic. This is a show I curated in New Jersey at Bergen Community College, which Diane Burko happened to be in, but I don't have any of her paintings here. Sorry, Diane. But this was a show that focused on weather and weather patterns, more metaphoric use rather than literal science, but it really dealt with the different ways that artists think of literally and symbolically. The image of the tree is actually a photographer named Dawn Dado who lived in New Orleans at the time of Katrina. What's my time?
1 minute.
Oh my goodness. All right, I'll fly through some of these images just quickly, just so images of what artists are doing. This is an artist who planted a field down by the East River under the Brooklyn Bridge, a giant pasture to talk about planting, greening the urban landscape. And then these are just some resources of the different artists' websites, Tatfu and Eve Mosher, who did High Waterline, our action guides, which we've been doing for artists, which are completely free and downloadable so that you can see what these artists are doing and wanting to share their vision. Eco Art Space has a video archive of artists giving talks about their work. So you can go into YouTube, Eco Art Space, and our blog. And that's about it.
Thank you.
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to all you in the back. And we had to turn off the air conditioning because it was really kind of getting Arctic down this end of the room.
Very Arctic.
So I'm going to be really brief. I'm going to show you one of my scarier, more unnerving moments in doing field reporting, which I've been doing now, as you heard, since the 80s. Like Mike, I've written about climate change, aspects of it from the White House to the North Pole to the Amazon rainforest and everywhere in between, including the Vatican. I was there for 4 days in May of 2014 at a meeting that set the stage for the encyclical. So I've seen just about every facet of this question over most of my professional lifetime. But I want to show you this one little episode. Hopefully the sound will work. We'll find out. When I was at the North Pole, and
first time in the history of the New York Times has attained the North Pole.
This was 2003.
Or reached it, and it's a remarkably red and white pole.
Just a couple minutes. So we're landing, that sea ice is 8 feet thick. The ocean is 14,000 feet deep underneath it, which is an unnerving experience. Jamie Morrison is a wonderful oceanographer who studies the ocean underneath the ice. And the only way to do that is to cut a hole through the ice and drop instruments down, and then divers come and get them back. But that's not the unnerving part. And then I'm going to tell you about something that was more unnerving than this. But once you see this, you'll understand the scope of what I'm talking about. The Russian helicopter was kind of unnerving, too. And these were Russian millionaires. I'm going to skip to I'm going to go right to the... Where am I? This is actually too fast. This is the longer version of this tape. I thought it was the... All right, this is the science camp, okay? There was no Russian millionaires there. 20 degrees below zero. And they're trying to answer one of the fundamental puzzles of what's going on with climate change. That water is 14,000 feet deep. And you can see this idiot is banging a 2x4 on the edge of the ice in one of the openings. I just don't think that is a very good idea. Oh, here we go. The ice is moving 2 or 3 miles a day. And there are like ridges forming and cracks opening.
You can feel the chunk that we're on actually starting to fail a bit more. Probably hairline cracks up towards the helos there.
So does that mean we should back up?
Not yet. You can always jump over a crack.
You can always jump over a crack, he said. Just remember that when you go, okay? And listen to that sound. That's all the ice. So I wanted to show you that, and I've been on a porch. Oh, sorry. Well, why did that start again? I was on a porch in the Amazon with a rancher whose son had murdered Chico Mendez, someone defending the rainforest. So I've been in some weird situations, but then what's most unnerving is not the climate science, not the sea ice science, not the durability of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which makes it build like unpaid credit card debt, which we're also not very good at dealing with. It's behavioral science. Starting in 2005, 2006 and onward, I started digging in on why human beings have a hard time getting their heads around certain kinds of risks. Remember the financial crisis? There were some people who said, it's coming. Think about the national debt. Think about the insolvency of some of our instruments for retirement and how we punt. Global warming is the ultimate example of something we're really good at, which is punting. And the more we focus on the social science, the better off we'll be in trying to understand ourselves. I called it in a piece a few years ago, our inconvenient mind. Mm-hmm. It's something that was left out of Al Gore's movie. He endorsed my first book on global warming back in 1992 when he was still Congressman Gore. Senator Gore at that point. Anyway, it's not just about Exxon. It's not just about people that some people like to call deniers. It's about the realities that are around us. The world is hard to change rapidly. Energy systems do not change overnight. I would love it if we could have an electrified, solar-powered planet tomorrow. It's not going to happen. And what that means is we have to get comfortable in a weird way with global warming. And I don't mean comfortable like, hey, let's have a party. But I mean comfortable with the fact that it's an issue much more like public health or poverty or cancer, where the American Cancer Society knows we're not going to solve the cancer problem tomorrow, but they exist. They do a lot of work. The scientists spend their careers focusing on questions like how to improve understanding of the disease, knowing that diseases that will still die. So it's more like that than like the old model that we had for this issue when I first started writing about it in the 1980s, 1990s. the idea that it's a crisis that must be solved. It's much more different than that. The scale that got us here, 200 years of growing reliance on fossil fuels, and a couple billion people in the world who still don't have enough energy, who can't turn on a light bulb, who don't have air conditioning to fix. 300 million people in India didn't know they had the world's biggest blackout several years ago because they don't have electricity. So that they need, this is when I hear, by the way, I moved to the opinion section of the New York Times 5 years ago after 15 years as a staff reporter, so I get to sort of say what I think. And when I think I have something to say. And one thing I think I have to say is to get comfortable with a long time scale. This is not a one president, not a one generation, not a one Paris meeting issue. Don't wait around for the UN to solve the global warming problem. The most constructive thing I've seen an environmental group do in recent years was there's a website set up by one of them that says the road through Paris, not the road to Paris. And I think if the more we understand this is a long climate march, not a one climate march in New York City kind of problem, the better off we'll be in the long run. And it's an uncomfortable message, but it's one after 30 years, literally, of looking at the human relationship to the climate system, I feel obliged to be honest about and clear about. I mean, I'm an advocate for reality, and the reality is it's a complicated problem. It's going to take time, and it'll be uncomfortable in many ways, figuring that out going forward. But get engaged, especially the young people in the room. There's so many ways to make a difference, and that's what makes me excited about it and not bummed out about it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful, Andy. Thank you. And our next speaker is Aaron O'Connor, who, as I said earlier, is the originator of the Arctic Circle residency program, which made this exhibition possible, and then this panel. It's you, Aaron. Thank you.
Aha. Hi, everybody. My name's Aaron O'Connor. I'm the founding director for a program called the Arctic Circle. We're an expeditionary residency program, which means we go sailing. We bring together international artists, contemporary artists, scientists, activists, architects, innovators, and educators, essentially stick them into a capsule for a 3-week period and see what comes out the other side. Frozen Earth is a fantastic example of minds that get together for a period. We provide that platform for them to get together for that period. And then they continue to collaborate from that moment, from the inception of that idea onwards through to the fruition of an idea. And I hope you've all had an opportunity to spend some time in the exhibit. Today was my first day, and I was thoroughly impressed. I don't know how to advance this, but thank you. We sail aboard. Well, first off, the Arctic Circle. Obviously, the Arctic is a core aspect of our program. It is our background the entire time that we are sailing. But part of our program as well is that we are sailing. We exist, live, eat, sleep, work, play, and exist on and within a capsule, a sailing vessel. It's an autonomous vehicle. All of our power, food preparation is done on this vehicle. It's also a great, any ship is a great piece of architecture in itself, and it's one of the reasons our program attracts architects as well, who we welcome into the discussion very much. So a barkentine tall ship is our home for the period of the residency. We sail as much as we can, and we sail without itinerary when we're in the high Arctic. We move based on the many concurrent project demands that are happening, and also we're going to let the ice conditions and weather conditions push us around. It's part of being that high north. The Arctic is certainly the boss when it comes to sailing. So that gives you a glimpse of where we are on the planet. North America to the left, Northern Europe to the right. Greenland, still white, as you can see, the pole just above that. And then there's a small archipelago of islands. We're about 10 degrees latitude off of the North Pole. That's called Svalbard. Everyone in this room is Svalbardian, you may or may not know. It's an international territory based on a treaty dating back to 1920. It's administered by Norway, but it is home to us all. And it was also a no man's land. There was never an indigenous population there. So humans began to explore there after its discovery. That date is in debate, but it is relatively recent in human history that we have visited there. It's become a hotbed for certainly the climate discussion, and that's necessary, not only a necessary discussion, but Svalbard is a living experiment, a living showpiece for many of the aspects of the climate discussion. Geopolitics is a big part of that area as well. Beautiful nature is part of that archipelago as well. It's part of our program. That's part of the background of our program. So that's where we exist. I should say the Arctic Circle program is an expeditionary residency program. We have existed in the Arctic for the last 8 years now. We will always remain the Arctic Circle, but we will begin to explore other parts of the world as well, remote and relevant parts of the world. Oh, down. That's what it looks like there. 60% of the archipelago is still glacial. Returning there year after year, the changes are noticeable. That's for the layman. My background is arts, not science. I'm a huge believer in bringing those disciplines together, put a scientist and an architect and an artist in a room, and cross-pollination will happen. I see it repeatedly, and I think it's important. The common denominator amongst all of those disciplines is that they are truth seekers by their own nature, by their discipline. It's a beautiful landscape, as we can see. It is changing. That's one. It's been brought to my attention on more than one occasion that when you delve into the Arctic Circle website, nowhere on our website does it, or within our literature, does it mention the term climate change or global warming. We're an arts program, so we leave it open to the artist and scientist amongst all disciplines to interpret the program and use it for their work. What we have seen is an enormous amount of interest from artists, architects, and scientists to come into our program to address climate change. And that speaks, allows our program to act as a survey, in a way, amongst the arts and sciences community for what they consider to be central issues of our time. And that's what our program does address. What are the central issues of our time? When that conversation happens amongst all those disciplines in a remote place, cut off from the rest of the world, what I have found to come from that is that climate change, as a central point, once examined further, the conclusion seems to be that what we're truly talking about is global environmental destruction. And that is with climate change as one important aspect of that. But truly we're dealing with our water, our watershed, our land, our air, our oceans, our lakes, our food chain. We've put the entire planet at risk, and further, when we further delve into that idea of what is environmental destruction, it seems to me the common cause that we can point a finger at is bad management. And I think about the idea of we all, for example, we all have the government that we deserve. An old Plato adage, I believe. Do we all have the environment that we deserve? And I think that's a question we must ask and take on the positive mindset like my esteemed colleagues have, and that there is a way forward. And there's no reason to roll around in the mud with the old deniers argument. I think if you haven't caught up to the ideas by now, I think they can sit it out and watch. I think it is our job to take a proactive stance, make a move, put a solar panel on your house, put a solar panel on your car, do something, make a move that is in a positive direction, live by example. I have a few images. Again, I was asked here to talk a little bit about the Arctic Circle program. So I can show you a little bit about what we do there. Again, 20 to 26 participants on average from all over the world. Typically 12 countries are represented per expedition. We're about to embark on our 10th expedition. This is one of my favorite images, and it happens every time that we're up there. When we let people loose into the landscape, into the safe zone, we keep people safe from bear territory. It is their backyard after all, and we are visitors. But I love to see how people will then begin to address the land, address their individual projects, and collaborate in an otherwise empty, unforgiving, yet beautiful landscape. And you can see the small ship in the background. Once you get further and further away from that home base, you realize just how dependent we are on that vessel to keep us alive. We encounter all types of different conditions while we're up there, and we take advantage of all of them. It is, again, unforgiving and often very challenging. It's a logistical juggling act every time we take on an expedition. That's part of what we do. It's great fun. It's just a snapshot of people working in the environment. Again, in my lifetime of working in the arts community, I've never seen a group of 20-plus artists get up at 7 o'clock in the morning and take to a full workday like they do up there. It's an impressive group time after time. I'm humbled and privileged to be able to work with them all. Science is a big part of what we do more and more. And again, that cross-collaboration and pollination of ideas is core to our beliefs as a program. We also spend time at Ny-Ålesund. It's the most northerly permanently inhabited scientific research station in the world. We have a reputation for showing up once a year and tapping a keg of beer and inviting them on board. They get a bit lonely up there. And again, there's been a number of collaborations and the sharing of ideas on an ongoing basis with Ny-Ålesund. I believe there's 11 research stations there that are managed by individual countries. Wildlife abound as well. It's part of what we do when exploring the landscape. What's wrong with this picture? Again, there's our backdrop for what we do in the high Arctic. It's a beautiful place to be. It's a privilege to be able to work there, but more so it is important that we as a program are able to bring our artists, scientists, our great minds together and allow them to work and do what they do. And again, part of what any artist or architect or scientist does is communicate, express ideas. And I'm down to 1 minute. There's a snapshot of our home again. She's a 150-foot, three-masted barkentine. It's hands-on sailing when we're up there. That's part of the program. It can be hard work at times and thoroughly enjoyable to the sailor at heart. I think that wraps it up. Thank you.
You've been a great audience. We thank you.